Sometimes I watch a video like this and I think,
why are we still here? Just to suffer?
But more importantly, I wonder something far grimmer than that. Will we ever stop suffering? And before the woke leftists canceling each other again. So why cover something so old and from someone in my own generalized YouTube subcommunity no less? For those of you who don't know, Innuendo Studios is a YouTuber who makes left-leaning content, most notably discussing the alt-right in a series I'd recommend to literally anyone. His content's worth subscribing to, I think. The link to the vid I'll be talking about will be in the description, and I encourage everyone watching this to watch it first, especially if you want the unfiltered context of the critique. To be honest, I don't even particularly like The Walking Dead Season 2. It's okay, but it was not only worse than Season 1, but had a lot of bizarre moments of awful writing, like the one we'll mainly be discussing. But when I saw Innuendo Studios' video, the direction it went in so perfectly exemplified something I hate in people I felt deep within me I had to talk about it. Not in spite of them being from my community, but because of it. This disgusting attitude pervades our community, and I want the permissibility of engaging in it to be destroyed. The worst thing is that I suspect a lot of people in my audience also feel comfortable acting in this way, so to be honest, I'm kinda low-key terrified of how some people are going to react to this essay and essays I'll be making on similar topics in the future. If you're one of those people though, and you might want some insight into why I have the criticisms I do of this video, you should watch my last video essay, Why Your Morals Suck. I feel like I'm gonna keep telling people to watch that video a lot. Also, if you want to help protect me from the potential backlash, or you're just generally concerned about the fact that I'm extremely financially insecure and can't afford food, meds, or rent for the next few months, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/satenmadpun, or making a one-time donation at paypal.me/satenmadpun. So, what's my problem with the video? Part 1. Jane or Kenny? Well, to get to that, I'm gonna let Innuendo Studios briefly describe the whole situation in Telltale's The Walking Dead for me.
The first season of Telltale's The Walking Dead is, at its core, a game about the relationship between protagonist Lee and the 9-year-old girl he swears to protect, Clementine, and, to a lesser extent, their makeshift community of survivors. Saddling the main character with a child preemptively answers a couple questions the player might otherwise ask. As you manage petty squabbles between a cast of antagonistic characters, any one of whom might get you killed, one question is, why don't I just leave these assholes? The answer being that, however dysfunctional, Clementine is probably safer in a group. The other question is, well, who gives a shit? What are the stakes if some dude we just met is maybe gonna die? How do we guarantee that's a difficult choice? Give players an impressionable child and make her convincing, and suddenly they're asking, what will this do to her? Will a decision protect her, scar her, toughen her up, preserve her innocence? In a game about making choices, that little girl is what makes your choices matter. Also, she's our hope for the future of humanity and our connection to the world before all this, and our main character's shot at redemption, and that's a thing male writers like to do with young girls in dystopias. It's called the dadification of games. I put a link down there. You should read it. It's a thing. But the protagonist of Season 2 is that little girl, grown 2 years older and seemingly a lifetime wearier. This inverts the questions she was originally meant to answer in some interesting ways. She spends a brief early section of Episode 1 separated from any adults, and the first question gets answered pretty handily. Whoa, fuck! Okay. Clementine needs to be in a group. And she quickly finds herself a new makeshift community of assholes. But the second question just hangs there. With no central relationship, the first episode feels like a game in search of meaning. She's making all these hard choices, but what makes those choices matter? Midway through Episode 2, I got my answer. I was coming up on a lodge with my companions, hoping to find shelter and honestly thinking about how much I miss Lee, when out of the crowd walks the second half of Season 2's central relationship. Okay, we're doing this. We don't really talk about Kenny.
But you know, maybe we should talk about Kenny. You see, the video doesn't start off that bad. Innuendo Studios goes on to explain how Kenny was in Season 1, a representation of devotion to one's family gradually distorted throughout the season by the losses he suffers into a dark vision of a future for the main character without Clementine. In Season 2, however, having failed in his main goal of protecting his family through the weakness he showed in the early days of the apocalypse, Kenny takes on a new pathology of rage and possessiveness he believes will save him from the unimaginable trauma he experienced before. This only worsens as Kenny experiences more trauma during the story.
So how Kenny died, or I guess didn't, is pivotal. I know there's a version of this story where if you're nothing but horrible to him for the entire game, he steals a boat and leaves you in Savannah, but in the ending most of us saw, Kenny is presumed dead after sacrificing himself for someone else. For my Kenny, it was Ben, who was, by the way, kinda sorta responsible for the raid that led to the death of Kenny's family, and whom Kenny had been insisting for days deserves to die, but per usual never actually laid a hand on him. While we were escaping a house via rooftop, Ben managed to impale himself falling off a balcony, and rather than let him get eaten by walkers...
What the fuck, Kenny? Lee, it's okay.
This was my Kenny forgiving Ben. This was my Kenny deciding that someone other than his own blood could be family. This was my Kenny finally doing what he couldn't do for his own son. Even as a purely symbolic gesture, this one time, he didn't run away. That we find Kenny alive in Season 2 unravels that entire character arc, and that probably should have bothered me, but honestly I was too busy pressing the Hug Kenny button. This is the first moment in the second game that just works, and the way it works is actually pretty sophisticated. See, Clem and Kenny don't really have a pre-existing relationship. They exchange hardly any dialogue through all of Season 1, but Clem's reaction to Kenny is credible and, provided the scene works for us, perfectly reflects our own. We miss Lee because we went through some awful shit with him and now he's dead. And as we feel his absence, we are given Kenny, someone else we've been thinking is dead, someone else with whom we suffered horrible experiences, someone whose role in the first game was to be a mirror for Lee. Kenny is a surrogate for Clem and for us. The game has already started presenting its thesis.
It's a tough world out there without people you can trust.
Which is a roundabout way of saying, who's going to be Clementine's new Lee? And at this point, Kenny seems like the closest we're going to get. We'll just have to do bullet points from here. So the people Clementine showed up with are apparently escapees from a dictatorial community run by this dude named Carver, who raids the lodge in order to get them back for reasons we're not going to go into right now. Several people die, including one of Kenny's friends, and the survivors are thrown into a truck and hauled off to Carver's camp. Once there, Kenny immediately starts pushing for an escape, and the plan they come up with involves Clementine stealing a couple of walkie-talkies. When Carver finds them missing, Kenny takes the blame, and in retribution, Carver beats him till he's blind in one eye. So, when the escape does happen, Carver is incapacitated, and while they could just leave him, Kenny stays behind to smash his head in with a crowbar, and Clem has the option of staying to watch. Outside, the escapees must pass through a herd of walkers, at which time Sarita is bitten, and while Clem can try to save her, one way or another she dies. And at this point, Kenny really and truly loses his shit and begins lashing out at everybody, but stays close to Clem, because Clem is now all he has left. Hope is rekindled somewhat when Rebecca... this is Rebecca, has her baby, and Kenny the family man falls in love with it. Then while making their way to the next town, they get ambushed by this kid named Arvo and his family, more people die in that shootout, and Kenny takes Arvo prisoner, choosing to keep him alive when Arvo promises them a cabin full of supplies. Still more people die on the way to the cabin, and when it briefly looks like the cabin is bare, Kenny beats the ever-loving shit out of Arvo. By this time, the rest of the group wants so badly to be away from Kenny that they steal a car in the dead of night, and Arvo, for good measure, shoots Clementine on the way out. Clem comes to in the backseat of a car with the only two adults left in her life, Kenny and Jane. This is Jane, screaming at each other, and the fight escalates and escalates and escalates until we're back here in the snow where Kenny is going to stab Jane in the heart unless Clementine shoots him. Fuck me! It's As if these new designers looked at everything the first game was, difficult, complex, emotionally taxing, but ultimately cathartic, and took from that only one adjective: bleak. Midway through the game, I chose to help a scared girl tend plants in a greenhouse, and to repay me for that kindness, in the next scene, Carver threw someone off a roof because I wasn't working fast enough. And that's the game in a nutshell. Traumatize a little girl, give her a bunch of binary choices that don't mean anything, kill secondary characters at random, salt and pepper to taste, and you've got a Walking Dead game. I didn't see what was going on while I was in the thick of it. It took a little while. But I think I get it now. My choices don't matter the way they used to, but that doesn't mean they don't matter at all. And this is still very much a game about a relationship. It's a relationship between a child and the broken, violent, self-hating man who wants to protect her so badly that he just might get her killed. She keeps him near because she knows she might need him, but no one knows better than her what he's capable of. She sees a soft and remorseful side that no one else sees. He's there to take care of her, but she frequently has to play the adult and take care of him. People are constantly telling her to get away from him while he swears up and down that he will always protect her, and he alienates everyone else who might keep her safe. God, it's textbook. Kenny is Clementine's abusive stepfather. I've seen a couple people mention this, though only passingly, and most seem completely unaware, which is so strange to me because it's only by understanding this that the design starts to make any sense. Whether or not you try to save Sarita, or comfort Rebecca's baby, or watch Kenny kill Carver will not affect the plot, and yet the game keeps telling you that these are major decisions, because they are things Kenny cares about. They are gestures of loyalty. Like Lee wondering, what will this do to Clem? Clem is wondering, what's this gonna do to Kenny? Which is a much more loaded question because Kenny is not just a person she cares about, but also a threat if not handled properly. And the whole game is building up to one final question of faithfulness. See, in the first game, Lee made decisions on Clem's behalf, and she had no say in the matter. The second game begins shortly after the first, where Clementine makes her first painful stumble into the adult world. She gets Omid killed when she leaves her gun unattended. The player has no agency in this scene. You cannot help but leave the gun on the counter. For the first time, Clementine is directly responsible for a person's death, but she does not have the power to prevent it. The arc of the game is bringing her from there to here, where she has the power to get someone killed, recognition of that power, and the ability to choose who it will be. And all the seemingly muddled design is what happens between those two scenes. The moments where she can get someone killed but doesn't realize it, the moments where she thinks she can save someone, but she can't. The game does not telegraph the difference between high and low level choices because Clem cannot yet recognize the difference. It's not a game about empowerment or disempowerment, but about the messy gray zone on the way from one to the other. It's a game about becoming Lee, about learning to make the choices he used to make. It's a game about growing up too fast and under heightened circumstances, about lurching into adulthood as an act of self-preservation. The game's question is, in crossing that threshold, will Clementine recognize Kenny for what he is?
Okay, I don't even think Innuendo Studios believes this bullshit. First of all, I find just the general idea that Kenny is the equivalent of an abusive stepfather not ridiculous, but it's definitely a stretch. You could make the argument. Certainly a lot of what Kenny did was not right or okay, but calling it abuse seems like, again, a stretch. But for now, I'm just going to assume that Kenny's actions 100% indisputably constitute abuse. Why does that mean that Jane is necessarily a better alternative? Now, whether or not Clementine wants to choose Kenny, Jane, or neither of them is irrelevant to me. She's a child and has certainly been mistreated by both of them the day it's her decision. But remember, Innuendo Studios' argument isn't that it's okay for Clementine to leave Kenny, but that Clementine should leave Kenny. This isn't an argument Clementine is making, but one Innuendo Studios is making on behalf of what he sees as her best interests. Any argument as such requires a much higher standard for acceptability. All abuse starts from the fundamental assumption that what the abuser wants is more important than what the victim needs. This is why abuse relies so often on obscuring the difference between a need and a want. For example, a physically abusive spouse might hit their partner and say something like, "Oh, look what you made me do," as though their want to hit their spouse were somehow a need equivalent to their spouse's need to not be hit. Additionally, when you've been mistreated in some way, especially when you're a cis girl, a lot of people often will use that abuse, with or without your consent, as an excuse to abuse others. Given these two realities, it's obvious to me at least that Jane is a far, far worse abuser than Kenny ever was. So, Innuendo Studios conveniently left out several details of what led up to the ending and who Jane even was. In fact, Innuendo Studios barely talks about Jane at all and seems to just think that because Kenny bad and Kenny abuser, Jane good. Watching this video, you'd really think Kenny was just killing and maiming people left, right, and center for no particular reason beyond his trauma. But let's look at the actual details of the plot. So, how did Kenny and Jane get to this point? Something Innuendo Studios thought was so irrelevant they refused to even mention it. Now, while Jane does teach Clementine a lot of practical lessons throughout the season, we get a lot of hints that she cares little about others. Starting off where we meet her, working for the psychopath Carver in episode 3, she helps Clementine and the rest of her group escape by shooting one of his asshole henchmen in the dick and leaving him to get eaten by zombies. I mean, he wasn't a great guy, but something tells me if Lee did something similar, he'd get a Clementine will remember that. Later on, Jane encourages Clementine to abandon the sheltered, traumatized, and now catatonic Sarah to die and get eaten by walkers, which Clementine can of course choose to do. I wonder if that ideology of weeding out mentally ill people for the sake of survival will ever come up later. Well, it does, because later on, Jane leaves the group because the weight of her leaving the mentally ill person in the group to die reminds her of the time she left her own mentally ill sister to die. Great. She's also, eaten glass.
You ate glass? I ate glass.
Which, you know, is not exactly evidence of her not caring about others, but also not something I wouldn't expect from someone who spends a significant amount of time trying to exterminate mentally ill people. Leading up to the final confrontation, Jane offers to watch the baby in the group, shortly after which Clementine is shot and the scene in the car happens. It's worth noting that there's a similar moment during that scene where Kenny, to use Innuendo Studios' phrasing, tells Jane exactly what she is.
Fuck you. You don't know a damn thing about me.
Oh, I know exactly what you are. Nothing. Nobody cares about you. And you don't care about nobody but yourself. That makes you...
But still, I can't help but find Innuendo Studios' own analysis of what Jane said bizarre.
Late in the game, Jane tells Kenny exactly what he is, and it's a perfect summation of how abuse works.
He loves having anyone around that does what he says. That's why he loves this kid so much. It can't talk back yet.
Fuck you!
You know the thing about people like you, Kenny? You're just a bomb waiting to go off. Everyone talks about you behind your back because they're afraid of you.
That ain't true!
Mike, Bonnie, Sarita.
Fucking liar, that ain't true!
Everyone around you knows that sooner or later, they're gonna end up dead. Sarita knew it, I know it, and so does Clementine.
And that exactly describes the relationship.
That makes you nothing.
What is it with you? It's your family, right?
Don't.
It is, isn't it?
I'm warning you, you little shit.
You're just another type A asshole trying to save a bunch of dead people.
This isn't the time for this.
No, this is exactly the time for this.
You listen to me. You mouth off about my family, and I will fucking end you.
Jesus Christ, I'm so sick of this wounded warrior crap. Just pull over. I can't take this.
What? Running away again? What a fucking shocker. In the end, still only care about yourself, right?
And where were you when Sarita died, Kenny? Huh? Where were you?
I was there. I couldn't... God damn you, I love that woman!
Nobody who died is anyone's fault. We all wanted to be together and it just went bad. But we owe it to them to try to make the best of this.
I'm sorry, Clem, but I can't put up with this bullshit anymore.
Oh, the feeling's mutual.
You know the thing about people like you, Kenny? You're just a bomb.
Let's note first that Jane deflected away Kenny's legitimate criticisms of her with probably the biggest cheap shot of 2015, trying to piss him off by insinuating he didn't love those around him enough, something he obviously cares a lot more about than her. Where was he when Sarita died? Right there, right beside her, in a situation where he literally couldn't have saved her, which, you know, Jane should have known, since she was also there, and suggested the plan in the first place. Jane goes on to make two main criticisms of Kenny, which Innuendo Studios believes is a perfect summary of how abuse works. a bit of a narrow perspective on the topic, but whatever. When Clementine says Kenny loves Sarita, Jane argues Kenny in fact loves having anyone around that does what he says. I'm not exactly sure what she means by this, but I'm guessing she means one of two things. She either means Kenny's problem is that he only loves people who do what he says, in which case the existence of Lee disproves that criticism, and James seems to be ignorantly confusing Kenny's basic need for familial connections with this complex. Or she means Kenny's problem is that he stops loving people who don't do what he says, in which case, citation needed. I don't see any evidence of him ever rejecting anyone he loved because they did something he didn't want them to do. Remember, this is the guy who thanked Clementine for killing him. Clementine also would have, in his eyes, been partially responsible for the death of Sarita, and yet this bomb waiting to go off narrative never materialized after her death, despite him being insanely angry about the situation, which is understandable. I don't know, this kind of just seems like a really manipulative way of referring to the dynamic of the average nuclear family. Jane then criticizes Kenny for the bomb waiting to go off thing. The insinuation is that because Kenny's trauma makes him generally irritable, which I would argue makes sense given his circumstances, and because he's violent with literal supervillains like Carver and Russians, that he has a significantly higher chance of being violent with Clementine. But this isn't supported, not by the text or just basic common sense. One would think, for example, that Joel from The Last of Us would be just as likely to be violent with Ellie, but no one who's played that game would ever even consider such a scenario. Obviously, being distrustful and violent towards strangers and villains in a zombie apocalypse when you've already lost a fuck ton of loved ones already, while it may increase the likelihood of you being violent with your own extremely underage loved one, certainly doesn't do so to an extent I would consider more important than the myriad of others to consider when deciding which of the two would be the better caretaker for Clementine. So, how did this fight get started? Well, after the argument, they get stuck in the road. Kenny goes out to look for gas, and Jane suggests to Clementine they abandon him right then and there. And the baby. Clementine's like, I don't know, man, I'm trying to chill, maybe should just calm down. And Jane internally, presumably, says, no, you don't understand. What you need isn't important. The fact that I don't like Kenny, that's important. He has to die. They have to leave at some point anyway, but when they crash, Jane straight up leaves Clementine behind while she's about to get eaten by zombies. They all find each other later on and the argument happens. This was ostensibly to prove to Clementine how crazy Kenny was, to make her distrust and abandon him before he became too crazy for anyone to handle, which, makes me wonder if Jane has ever heard of something called a self-fulfilling prophecy. She deliberately pretended that she either killed or lost a baby that Clementine and Kenny were always far more concerned about than she ever was. Then when Kenny got mad, asked a rhetorical question, and Telltale's animation is so bad here, I genuinely can't tell whether he was trying to punch her or press her against the wall here, especially since he does the latter right after. But anyways, after she escalates to lethal force by pulling a knife. She then tries to de-escalate, which is good, and Kenny escalates in that one instance. Bad, Kenny, bad. While thinking this person just left a baby to die, reasonable suspicion given her track record with abandonment. Jane responds to his grapple by beating the fuck out of him, which, fair enough, you could argue he was asking for it in that instance. Clementine pulls her off, Kenny gathers himself and starts going towards her, and she slices his belly open with her knife. I'm just going to remind everyone that as of yet, Kenny has not hit Jane once. Then she starts escalating and aggressing on him once she thinks she has the upper hand. She then says this.
Jane, back off!
No, Clem. It's time to put this crusty piece of shit out of his misery.
Look, I really hate this term. I think it's ridiculously overused and generally expresses reactionary attitudes, even if it's mainly employed in left-wing contexts. So please, for the love of God, know that I do not say this lightly. But still, yikes. That's pretty bad, man. I don't know. During the fight outside, Jane attacks Kenny's wounded eye, real high blow there, He grabs her knife and, obviously recognizing this person is trying to have him and his loved ones killed for no good reason, and obviously very angry and upset at this, decides to try to kill her. This is not a good thing. In fact, when I first played the season, I picked Jane just because of the simple calculation that I didn't want to kill either of them in the first place, and when I got to make the choice, Kenny was the one pressing the knife into Jane's chest. I am not, in fact, endorsing murders of passion, even if I believe Kenny would have been a far better caretaker for Clementine than Jane. But I will say Jane's behavior reminds me a lot of an old Kevin Hart joke. Going back to the whole, when you've been mistreated in some way, people often use that abuse as an excuse to abuse others thing. I mean, I don't even have to explain myself for that one, right? I'll mainly just discuss the whole putting wants over needs thing then. The reality is, as I mentioned earlier, Jane's clearly thought about Clementine. What you need isn't important. The fact that I don't like Kenny, that's important. He has to die. Jane put her want for a power trip in to get rid of Kenny out of spite, or as she might have put it, the need to show Clementine what Kenny was really like, over Clementine's need for loving caretakers. And the thing is that the idea of pushing someone to their breaking point to prove they're bad to a child you're explicitly trying to manipulate is not only a self-fulfilling prophecy, but an abuse tactic. Jane, in my opinion, is far more abusive than Kenny ever was. By choosing Jane, Clementine would be playing into the hands of even worse abuse from complete indifference to the problems they cause and perpetuate. That, my friends, is the characteristic abuse of liberalism, but we'll get to that later. By Innuendo Studios' own admission, Kenny's problem was the opposite of Jane's selfishness. For all his faults, and he had a lot of them, oh boy, or even besides the anger management, anyone remember this shit?
Hey, Lee, you know how to pick a lock, right?
No. Why would you say that?
Well, you're, urban?
Oh, you are not saying what I think you're saying.
Jesus, man, I'm from Florida. Crazy shit just comes out of my mouth sometimes. Sorry.
Kenny was a person who cared deeply for his loved ones, and meant a textual representation of utter devotion to one's family. More than that, he was a representation of the damage such a large amount of grief causes a person. But while Innuendo Studios points out that the subtext of what those comments mean in the context of Kenny's mental health gets ignored for the most literalist possible reading of what was said. According to their argument, we're supposed to believe that it's more likely that the writers of Telltale's The Walking Dead were breaking the fourth wall to hammer home their theme, than that Kenny, an extremely depressed person who had just been shot by someone he loves while trying to kill someone, said that more out of a mixture of low self-esteem and not wanting to unnecessarily cause Clementine to blame herself right before he died. Bitch, I can't Bitch, I cannot. Wait, hold on. How am I gonna sound like Kenny? Hold on, I'm gonna do my white voice. Bitch, I can't believe you just shot me. All of this is your fault. Fucking evil. All of this is your fault. Fucking evil piece of shit kid. You best believe I'ma be on that ass with them. I'm about to die. You best believe I'ma be on that ass with them haunts at the end of the night. Kenny, no! Okay, how am I gonna do a white woman voice now? Hold up. Damn, Kenny's dead. Sucks. Good news is AJ's alive. You're not gonna believe this. Even if Kenny thought he should have died in that moment, it doesn't mean he should have died. Otherwise, if the game just told you what to believe, the choice would have been meaningless. The point of this confrontation was clearly to not have a 100% correct side, and obviously Kenny was at fault with his actions at many points during the season, but there is always one fundamental difference that made Kenny a far better caretaker for Clem. Kenny, unlike Jane, was aware of his flaws. The cowardice Innuendo Studios derives likely helped in that regard. He probably went through more character development than anyone, especially in the first season, and I think that was because the same instinct that caused him to abandon his morals in tough situations for the sake of his family also caused him to not double down which you can see in the first season, especially with regards to his treatment of Ben. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Now, while you might have heard that quote before, it's actually massively out of context, so frankly didn't mean what the quote might suggest. But as a popular saying, it still works, though I'd like some amendments. I prefer the phrase, "those who sacrifice any principle." Those who sacrifice any principle for security deserve neither. There are situations in which giving up safety in the short term can be preferable to both a long and short term alternative, see the Holocaust. But if we can speak of security and safety as being two separate things, and that safety is the absence of danger, whereas security is the peace of mind caused by eliminating the fear of future danger, then the quote becomes more accurate. For Franklin, such people would have been the reactionary loyalists to the British Crown. In the Russian Revolution, it would have been the White Army. For black people, it's white liberals. Wherever and whenever there has existed a politics of change, there have been people fighting against that change to ensure their own security. You can attain neither security nor another principle by choosing security, because so long as neither exists, progress is necessary, and security is the enemy of progress. Progress was impossible with Jane, and so unlike Kenny, for which healthy dialogue and improvement was not only possible, but something he wanted, Jane was unlikely to ever change her abusive behavior without an event so life-changing I, as the player, could not reasonably expect Clementine to ever bring it about. But I determined this about Jane after I'd already shot Kenny. Clementine didn't have perfect information, so what she should have done then is much more of a gray area. If at the end of the day I was in that situation and I had to choose between an abusive piece of shit who actually cares about me and an abusive piece of shit who doesn't, I would choose both. At the end of the day, neither of them is really my enemy. Part 2. Who is the enemy? Surprised? You might have expected this all to be a Jane Dunkfest, but fuck that. If you thought this could have been the case, then surely you've learned nothing. At least not yet. The lesson is not actually you should hate a different kind of abuser. Fuck that. Though I hate this behavior and hate abuse generally, my goal is not to get you to hate a person, but to hate a behavior. People change, but a behavior on its own is what it is. There's a great danger in essentialization. It is not enough for me for someone to simply be an abuser for me to write them off. Everyone has flaws, and flaws are tolerable to a certain extent. And when dealing with a situation like a zombie apocalypse where you really want as many people working towards the same goal as you as possible, it takes a lot more than some otherwise fixable behavior for me to write someone off completely. Like I said before the confrontation, I had no interest in either of their deaths, and it would take a lot more than some essentialized notion of abuse for me to change that opinion. That notion is really Innuendo Studios' MO here, a way for them to relinquish critical analysis in favor of simplicity. Their thought process seems to be, if I label Kenny with the term abuser, I don't have to think about how complex the situation really is. The details of his life don't matter, and the details of the abuse don't matter. All that matters is these abstract terms, and through them any retaliation is justified, no matter the true motive behind it. Innuendo Studios brings up Kenny's trauma just to dismiss it as an explanation for his actions, instead of critically engaging with it. Instead, he defaults to conservative tier personal responsibility, just act how I want regardless of how reasonable a request it is, or you're forever a bad person level arguments to deflect from the fact that they abandoned Kenny not so much because of what he is, but what they fear he could become. They really believed Kenny should be responsible for his actions no matter what. They wouldn't try to justify it, because in our society, that this abusive attitude is okay is considered self-evident for most people. Since they know their audience is smart enough to not take everything at face value, they have to provide a justification for the abuse. It seems to me, based on how Innuendo Studios deliberately deployed their arguments in this essay, that they chose Jane because they wanted anyone but Kenny. And they wanted anyone but Kenny because they couldn't stand that he represented a side of humanity that fundamentally clashes with their ideology. Not one filled with unjustified rage upon losing their share of power like the alt-right, but one that is angry at the world, and is really, really right to be. They find any excuse to see Kenny as a liability. I find it so telling that the Steam forum post Innuendo has recommended as a good analysis of why Jane is a better choice lists these self-centered and ridiculously functionalist arguments, like, in typical colonialist fashion, that she's supposedly more rational and can teach Clementine survival skills better, all while ignoring the fact that Kenny and Clementine have a genuinely caring relationship while Jane doesn't appear to have ever had a caring relationship with anyone. We also get this gem, so let's face it, Kenny's not going to get better. Telltale is not going to do a complete turnaround and make him a perfect angel with a fairy tale ending where all his trauma and unstableness just disappears. He's still going to cause havoc in groups, try to get what he wants through intimidation and force, explode over small things, etc. Again, have you people ever heard of a self-fulfilling prophecy? This is on the level of the police saying, I think black people are violent, so I'm going to put them in situations where they're more likely to be violent, and then blame them for being more violent. And you know, as a black person, TM, I believe the discrimination disabled people face is on the level of the worst kinds of racial discrimination. Even though Kenny is a white man and may not have been discriminated against at the start of the series, Jane's treatment of Kenny represents a pattern of extremely serious oppression most disabled people are all too familiar with. And to see someone who claims to care about the far right promote this nearly fascist view of our community is, well, under neoliberalism I wouldn't say surprising, but certainly disappointing. Innuendo is fearmongers about Kenny to make us think there's somehow some great possibility he will be violent with Clementine, despite nothing in the series suggesting this, and in fact not even the Steam forum post suggesting this. The reality is that mentally ill people are far more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators, and this is the logic that so often drives violence against us. This is the logic that caused Jane to do what she did. But even after all that, I still would have tried to keep Jane in the group. Because the reality is that if you thought you could get through something as traumatic as a zombie apocalypse, perpetually avoiding living and working with messy, imperfect, and traumatized people, you were dead wrong. If you thought you could get through something as traumatic as capitalism, perpetually avoiding living and working with messy, imperfect, and traumatized people, you were dead wrong. You will always experience suffering and abuse until you grow up and reckon with why it happens. Extinguish these fucking infantile notions of responsibility, because you know they are the lies you tell yourself to sleep better with the suffering you perpetuate. Now, of course, I'm not saying you should never leave an abusive situation, or that I would never suggest leaving an abusive situation. For example, when Clementine and her group were kidnapped by Carver's group, it was reasonable to fight them and run away, because Clem's needs and his wants conflict inherently. Clementine needs her and her group to survive and be safe, but Carver wanted to exploit others by any means necessary. Whatever flaws Jane and Kenny had, what they wanted didn't inherently conflict with the idea of keeping the group safe. What Jane did, to me, crossed that threshold. My memory isn't perfect, but I'm pretty sure that when she told me what she did, I just walked away. It solidified for me that Jane above all cared about her own survival more than the survival of us all. But I didn't like it. I felt sad as I left. I didn't want to. But I knew for Clementine's safety, and for the safety of everyone Jane ever interacted with in the future, I had to. I thought that if you acted like abuse on that level was acceptable by giving them what they wanted with their abuse, then the abuser would begin to see it as acceptable. And I was right. In the next season, where in every Aftermath flashback Kenny is shown to have helped and genuinely cared for Clementine, Jane kills herself soon after being with Clementine, leaving her to take care of the baby by herself. Leaving Jane was the best I could do in that situation. Clementine got rewarded in Season 3 for abandoning those who loved her with abandonment because the links that connect those who care for no one but themselves are always tenuous. I bet Jane never thought about what would happen to Clementine and the baby after she died. The thing is that I understand where this attitude comes from. I'm an abuse victim, and to be honest, I've gone through abuse so bad most people would cry, throw up, or do some of both if I gave the details. I'm also a black, autistic, chronically mentally ill queer person, and have faced a lot of discrimination in my life. And because of that, despite all my philosophy on the need for universal love and restorative justice and all that, I've gone through so much that I don't think I'll ever, as hard as I will continue to try, completely eliminate the hatred I feel for just like anyone with an average or above amount of privilege. But yet I'm constantly shocked by how much more understanding I show to people's life experiences in comparison to the average person. Like, ever since I was born, despite me hating people. The kind of hate I naturally feel towards those who perpetuate the system that oppresses me is at least one that's passionate, one that wishes they would change, that I won't have to feel the hatred that is the source of all this suffering. It's one that's invested in them as human beings. But the way the average person under capitalism treats people they have no personal investment in is far, far worse than any hatred I could muster for them. It is a sliding scale of indifference to your very humanity. Even love is some degree of transactional. And I'm not going to pretend like Kenny's love for Clementine wasn't mainly transactional, that it wasn't fueled by his desire to replace his loved ones. There were certainly times when that caused Kenny to act abusively, especially towards people he had no attachment to. But at least love is a beautiful thing, and at least the more love there is in the world, generally, the better off the world is. But what Jane feels for Clementine, what Innuendo Studios feels for Kenny, that is just evil. But this goes beyond just Innuendo Studios. I want to ask anyone watching this, would you really abandon someone you loved over something so trivial when you knew doing so would destroy them and a part of yourself, just because you suspected you could personally benefit more from it? The worst part is I know that for a lot of people watching right now, if they look deep down and they're honest with themselves, their answer is going to be yes. And that's fucking sickening, man. Thanks so much to Andrew Tapp, Pamphleteer, Reed, Garrett Polk, Jacqueline Rudich, Jigglypuffer, Krampus, Questing Refuge, and the Silver Samaritan for sponsoring today's video. If you'd like to have your name read at the end of these videos, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/satenmadpun. You can also make a one-time donation at paypal.me/satenmadpun. Alright guys, I'm gonna be uploading like a motherfucker like in the next couple of weeks, so y'all stay tuned for shit. Stay tuned for my fucking album, the motherfucking EP. I'm probably gonna be doing a live stream related to this shit pretty soon, probably the next couple of days. Stay tuned for the shit. Yeah. Bye!